This is a pro wrestler you absolutely need to know about. A territory wild man, a pro wrestling pioneer, and a regional megastar, Pampero Firpo. So when it comes to Pampero Firpo, the connection that gets hammered the most is to the Macho Man Randy Savage, from the wild hair to the big beard to the, oh yeah. I'm not good at impressions. But once you start digging into Pampero, his influence goes much further. While it may not exactly always be a 1 + 1 = 2 level of inspiration, the influence, the bringing of ideas into pro wrestling is absolutely there. He is one of those first old school pure brawlers, like a more compact Bruiser Brody. He's not the type of wrestler that's going to sit on the mat and trade arm bars for 35 minutes. Armed with his trusted sidekick, a shrunken head, Pampero also helped introduce wrestling to the mystical, the magical, leading the way for the likes of Kevin Sullivan, Papa Shango, even Vince McMahon's lawyers, who have kept that man out of prison for the last 40 years using what can only be the dark arts. And for fans of this era of wrestling, Pampero Firpo immediately registers as a big deal. In fact, if you know a pro wrestling fan that's roughly 65 and you want some instant credibility, mention Firpo. And once they let their guard down and you're in, you ambush them. You tell them about Yoshihiko, the Japanese pro wrestling blow-up doll. And you watch the light escape their eyes as everything they knew and everything they loved about pro wrestling turns to ash in your hands. And Firpo's story also does a lot to show the power of pro wrestling media, and how not everyone's story gets equal screen time. His place in wrestling history has kind of been reduced to Macho Man said, oh yeah, too, and he is way more important and way more complex than that. But if there is someone out there fighting for his legacy, it's his daughter, Mary Freeze. From what I could tell, Mary did the pro wrestling podcast circuit a couple of years ago, and that sort of compilation of knowledge is going to be my main source for this episode. Also, like articles, Cage Match, cagematch.net. Maybe it's right.
It's Cage Match. It may be right, but it probably isn't. Yeah!
Speaking of pro wrestling history, let's get into the story of Pampero Firpo. Juan Cashimanian was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, April 6, 1930. Juan's dad was a 1936 Olympic boxing hopeful that didn't quite make it because his status as a refugee prevented him from representing Argentina. Why was he a refugee in Argentina? Well, not for a super chill reason. I'm not going to get into the weeds about Turkey's genocide of the Armenians on this pro wrestling show, but just know that Cashimanian Sr. was an Armenian in Turkey around 1915, and he got the hell out of there, eventually landing in Argentina. But this Russian-ish, Armenian-ish, Turkish-ish background is going to come into play later for a lot of Juan's gimmicks, and obviously this also explains why he is born in Argentina. After the whole Olympic thing, Papa Cashimanian fell back into promoting boxing and also working at a factory. Little Juan followed in his dad's footsteps, getting into boxing as a teen. However, Juan didn't quite have that killer streak in him. He's the type of person who would knock down his opponent and then go check on him. And that's sort of a running current for Firpo's life. Under this chaotic, crazed madman character that struck fear into the hearts of millions was this kind, warm, intelligent, good person who, by pro wrestling standards, is a saint. While Juan was growing up, Argentina had military conscription. So basically, they had a lottery-style draft where guys of military age had to go serve a little bit. Juan won that lottery. Yay! But oddly enough, it was his time in the Argentinian military that got him into pro wrestling. As the story goes, while serving in the Argentinian military, Juan was approached by a superior officer who had mistakenly thought that he was related to a local pro wrestler with the same name, and the officer wanted some tickets. Even though he was not related to that wrestler, Juan went to the Luna Park Fed to go get tickets, which is a level of anxiety and just not wanting to deal with people that I deeply relate to. While Juan was there, the promoter saw him and was impressed. Juan was on the shorter side, at least compared to his US pro wrestling contemporaries of the era, but he was a wide, strong guy. Kinda jacked in a not prayer and vitamins sort of way, big enough for the Argentina promoter to be interested in him. Pampero was often billed at 5'8", 230. I don't know if he was 230, but as you'll see later, once he has his character down, his level of intensity and his selling of his gimmick makes him feel like a giant amongst men that were literally bigger than he was. So after meeting the promoter, one thing leads to the other, and Juan starts training to become a pro wrestler. Now on Wikipedia, Rudy Dusick is credited with training our boy. Rudy was a wrestler from Nebraska, primarily working in the mid-1920s, the 1930s, 40s, a little bit of 50s. In the early versions, the skeleton of what would go on to become the NWA. Saying he trained Firpo in the sense that he taught him the basics, that he brought him into wrestling, feels very wrong. I mean, I guess I can't prove that he didn't roll down to Argentina to train some random people, but probably not. At best, Rudy and the other Dusick bros likely coached him up on the American version of wrestling once Juan got here in the late 50s, so more of a continued education kind of thing. So as far as his start, daughter Mary says she has a photo of Juan from his first match in Argentina in 1951, still looking pretty clean cut like his military days. And this could have been a training match, this could have been like amateur wrestling while he was in the military, but either way, by 1953, Juan is in the pro wrestling business for real. As Juan was putting in the work, getting reps, and figuring it all out, he started playing around with gimmicks, as most young wrestlers do. There was El Russo, riffing on his Russian-ish background, Irvin the Armenian, a nod to his dad's heritage, and then for most of his young career, he was Ivan the Terrible, which is a pretty intense gimmick if you know who Ivan the Terrible is. And Ivan the Terrible is basically Juan's gimmick as he grinded his way through South America, working his way north into Mexico, where he would go on to wrestle El Santo and Gory Guerrero. And you can't tell the story of Firpo without his tag team partner, Chimu. While in Ecuador, Juan was giving a possibly real shrunken head by a tribal leader, which he called Chimu, named after that tribe's god of good luck. Now, was it real? Maybe. Was it a little character building, gimmick enhancing thing he got at some gift shop? Also, maybe. I don't know how many remote Ecuadorian tribesmen are rolling up to pro wrestling shows. Either way, Ron carried Chimu pretty much his entire career, using it a lot in promos to sort of establish that
spiritual, spooky wooky feel.
And while we're on the topic, Firpo was a great promo. He had that grisly, gravelly voice. He was intense. He was captivating. He was someone who, when he was cutting a promo, you stopped what you were doing and you watched it. And English was just one of his 7 spoken languages, and he learned to speak it well enough to connect with audiences as a good guy and a bad guy. While in Mexico, Juan became pals with Antonino Rocca, who put in a good word for him in America. If you're not super familiar with Rocca, just know for parts of the 50s, he was the most over pro wrestler on earth. By summer of 57, Juan landed in Texas, with his first match being against Don Leo Jonathan. And again, he's starting out here in Texas as Ivan the Terrible. Of course, Texas would have made him a evil foreign hill, whether he was from Argentina or Russia or California. In Texas, Ivan the Terrible quickly scooped up the NWA Texas Heavyweight title, as well as the Texas Tag Team titles with Nikita Zolotov. And Pampero is coming into a territory system that is almost a decade old at this point. Things are established, organized, and Firpo would hop on that circuit. And from there, Ivan the Terrible was off in the US. He was traveling the territories, trying to make a name for himself and scaring little kids with his tiny shrunken head. It was trips to St. Louis, Chicago, Indy, Omaha, Houston, Dallas, Minneapolis, all the way to 1960. By roughly 1960, Juan would reach his final form, landing on the name Pampero Firpo, which directly translates from Spanish to English as Pampero Firpo. As his daughter laid it out, this was a reference to Luis Angel Firpo, the first Latin American boxer to challenge for the world heavyweight title, at the time against Jack Dempsey. Crazy match, he knocked Jack out of the ring, almost won. I don't know, this isn't a boxing thing. Well, Jack ended up being a special guest at one of Ivan the Terrible's American shows. Jack pulled him aside and asked if maybe the Russian gimmick was a little bit stale. Let's definitely not do it 1,000 times over the next 50 years. Basically, he was like, hey, you're from Argentina. Firpo is still a name most people know. You should reference that, maybe even be his son. And apparently Juan's real dad, who was also a real boxer, saw this origin story in a publication and thought, hey, what the f***? So 1960 is when Juan drops Ivan the Terrible, for the most part, and begins working as Pampero Firpo. Basically, taking the boxing name and mixing it with Pampero, which is a strong wind that blows across the Pampas region of Argentina and Uruguay, which is a good way to describe Firpo. He kind of blew into matches like a hurricane. Crowned with a new name, he went to the Northeast, wrestling for Jess McMahon and or Vince McMahon Sr. Capital Wrestling. There he worked with the young Bruno Sammartino. He mixed in Bearcat Wright, old pal Antonino Rocca, and later on, Buddy Rogers. And Capital was really going to become his home base over the next couple of years, as he'd ping-pong out to another territory and then come back to Capital. By 62, Pampero had another big run in Texas, actually going back to Ivan the Terrible, because that's what he had gotten over with in Texas, and it's not like people are going to know he's two separate gimmicks. They ain't got camera phones yet. Firpo then expanded to the other side of the country, working in California. He also made it up to the Pacific Northwest, and he'd lose an NWA world title shot to Luthez. So between Fez, Bruno, Buddy, Rocca, throw in El Santo, and Gory, you don't really get bigger names in this era. I mean, Gorgeous George, but Firpo's right there in the mix. By now, Firpo had also started working what would be a very important promotion for him, AWA, working with AWA pillars like The Crusher, Wilbur Snyder, and Danny Hodge. And we're still in like the 60s here. This isn't going to be his most readily available work, but specifically AWA is going to be huge for preserving Firpo because they later had really great TV and tapes that weren't burned or stolen or re-recorded over. And surviving footage also provides snapshots of Pampero's actual wrestling style, which is different. If we're speaking from a perspective of kayfabe, he's not as large as some of these US wrestlers, so taking them on head-on using old traditional wrestling moves is bad strategy. So as a fighter and a wild man, his game was to maul people, and even his finisher, the dreaded claw, was a nod to this. So not exactly the work rate of Danielson or Styles, but it like all packaged made sense with the gimmick. In 66, Pampero went global, doing a tour of Australia for the OG WCW. There, he worked with wrestlers like Luther Lindsay, Pepper Gomez, Dominic Nucci, and Nick Bockwinkel. But it was coming back from Australia, April of 66, that Pampero found another home base to work out of, Hawaii. And you can kind of carve his career into three pieces. There's the Ivan era, working in South America and Texas. There's the bigger piece, the enormous legacy of Pampero Firpo working across the world. But that last kind of face of Foley was working in Hawaii and 50th State Big Time Wrestling, where Pampero was the man. Pampero was brought in as the traditional wild man heel he typically was, but he was just so cool and memorable, he started to get over as a face. So the office just rolled with it, having him help out Hawaii star Prince Maivia, making Firpo an all-out good guy. But we do get a bit of a character wrinkle. Ed Francis apparently didn't like the Firpo name, and said in an interview that it was Chimu that actually triggered the name change to The Missing Link, well before Dewey Robertson used the same name. The Missing Link worked face and became a massive star in Hawaii. One obituary quotes Juan saying, "In Hawaii, after the governor, I was the most popular man." And the way Hawaii's TV was set up, it gave wrestlers these big, chunky segments, and Firpo's look, energy, and very distinct voice allowed him to do some real character development. He was also in the ring with Hawaiian wrestling royalty, the Maiavias, handsome Johnny Barran, King Curtis. So again, he is rubbing shoulders with these massive names in the main event scene. However, things weren't always good in Hawaii. Something happened to make Pampero need a life-saving intestinal surgery June of '66. A surgery that kept him for 33 days at Queen's Hospital and out of action until October. Several rumors float around about what exactly happened. Everything from a good old-fashioned territory stabbing to a spleen injury during a match with Johnny Barran, even diverticulitis. Whatever it was, it resulted in a big surgery scar, and Pampero would wear a singlet to cover it for the rest of his career. But overall, Hawaii was a great place to be in with, because not only is it just like a cool place to work, it's Hawaii. It's the perfect stop on your way to Japan, which Firpo started working as early as '67 for JWA. Back over in the continental US in '67, Firpo became the first recognized America's heavyweight champ in LA. Now there is some debate whether he actually beat Colasetti for the title, or if this was one of those famous territory things where they're just like,
Tell him you won the title, kid.
but he would go on to hold this belt 3 times. And California would later become a very important territory, a very important state for Firpo, but this time for real life reasons. It's where he settled down for good in the early 70s. By that point, he had 3 kids, and as they reached kindergarten age, the family didn't want them switching schools on a territory promoter's whim, so they set up shop in San Jose. Now obviously, he's still a pro wrestler, he's still gonna travel a lot, but at least the family can unpack for a while. Back in '68, Pampero had a proper Japan run for Japan Wrestling Alliance, where he wrestled a young Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki. Then in '72, Firpo started wrestling select dates for WWF against world champion Pedro Morales, and he would also settle down in Detroit's Big Time Wrestling, which was more than Detroit. It kind of had its fingers across the Midwest. And Detroit is some of Firpo's best and most remembered work. This is top of the card wild man brawler, standing shoulder to shoulder with the likes of Bobo Brazil, The Sheik, absolute Midwest wrestling gods. Firpo would go on to win Big Time's US heavyweight title 3 times across the 1970s, including multiple switches with Bobo Brazil himself. Despite Detroit's Big Time Wrestling being the anchor for Pampero at this time frame, the territory system was still alive and well, so he's not staying anywhere too long, but he did stay busy. In the early 70s, he snuck into Jim Crockett Promotions for a minute. He had regular dips over to AWA, headed up north to Maple Leaf Wrestling in Canada, as well as touching down in home base for NWA Hollywood and Roy Shire's San Francisco territory. In '75 and '76, Firpo had his last big AWA run, and by now, TV is more of a thing, production value is up, and basically every territory has some version of TV. He had a big feud with Baron von Raschke, giving us the Bending the Metal Bar promo, which you can find up on YouTube. He took on Nick Bockwinkel for the AWA title, and he was also working spots with Frank Gagne, Bobby Heenan, The Axe, The Valiants, kind of all the big AWA names. Then in '79, there is a very interesting overlap, if cage match is to be believed. There was a big-time wrestling match between Pampero Firpo and Randy Savage in Detroit, April 14th, 1979 at Cobo Arena, with Pampero getting the win. And Pampero's influence on Macho Man is well documented, and artists influence other artists. I think the quote is, good artists borrow, great artists still, oh yeah, from Pampero Firpo. Randy Savage to me is the greatest, most complete pro wrestler ever, and I think it's kind of cool that pieces of Firpo, went on to live through him. And Randy's from a wrestling family. He had high levels of athleticism, professionalism, and intensity, and he was likely always going to be some level of successful in this industry. But I think it's fair to ask, without Pampero's influence, would Randy have ever found kind of that hook that would turn him into a generational superstar, a pop culture icon? We'll never know because it happened. But there is an alternate universe out there where this random Argentinian soldier doesn't go get wrestling tickets, and we live in the butterfly effect of that. Now, as we wind down, there is this sort of final international push for Firpo. In 1979, Pampero goes to Puerto Rico and takes the WWC Puerto Rico Heavyweight Championship off of Abdullah the Butcher before dropping it to Carlos Colon. Then in 80, he does a tour of all Japan, even working with Bruiser Brody, which had to be trippy for everyone. He also worked with, of course, Baba, Jumbo Tsuruta, a young Haku, and even the great Ernie Ladd. But by the 80s, Pampero was slowing down. He was roughly 3 decades into pro wrestling. He was in his 50s, and sadly his other daughter had gotten very sick, so he stepped away from the business. Pampero technically retired, but did have these kind of random one-off matches, I think the last of which is 86. Following pro wrestling, Pampero just took normal jobs, eventually landing a 2-decade career at the USPS processing mill. Meanwhile, Chimu went off the rails, falling victim to the vices of the industry. The women, the pills, chasing the rush of being a tiny little head performing in a packed arena. And it is in this time frame that he goes radio silent. But Juan just kind of lived a nice, long, normal life following pro wrestling. Like there is a definite line in the sand for Act 1 and Act 2 of his life. Then sadly, January 9th, 2020, his family released news that the great Pampero Firpo passed away just months shy of his 90th birthday. And the family statement mentioned that he was loving, generous, and protective. So what should Pampero Firpo's legacy be? Well, it's not as easy as saying he did the first drop kick. All drop kicks are because of Firpo. He had this career that quietly echoes throughout history. Firpo was inducted into the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame in 2018. He was publicly honored at the Cauliflower Alley Club in 2001. And you'd think between his big Capital Wrestling runs and even the matches with WWF champ Pedro Morales that WWE would at least give him that kind of flash on the screen, you're in the Hall of Fame induction, but nothing so far. But if you let everything about him kind of snowball, his inspiration and his effect on the industry absolutely piles up. He was a regional megastar who just happened to wrap up before national expansion. Parts of his work were basically continued to some degree by Macho Man. Pampero wrestled in easily double-digit countries across multiple continents. He scooped up regional titles in just about every promotion he touched, and he was always massively popular whether he was a face or a heel. His resume is of a person who should be discussed way more to a much higher esteem. He was the kind of wrestler that you just immediately get. His aura sucked you in and taught you everything you needed to know about him in all of 5 seconds. But no matter how you want to break it down, Pampero Firpo was a headliner and a box office attraction who could go anywhere and immediately be a game changer. And I don't know what else you could possibly ask from a professional wrestler.